Welcome to this video series about improvising by Sietze de Vries. You can support this video series by donating the amount of your choice to Sietze de Vries' Patreon account, which can be found by searching Sietze de Vries Patreon or by finding the link in the description below the video. Enjoy the video.
In the next videos I want to focus more on counterpoint, so a more complex way of improvising actually. And I talked about it before, and I always make the comparison to horizontal and vertical thinking. What I mean with that is that we basically did a lot of harmonizing so far. So we had a melody and we put chords underneath. So that's basically the vertical thinking. We already focused a little bit on making little ornaments, some motifs, so that we have a more horizontal way of thinking, so that it's not only about the chord, but also how do you get from one chord to the next. And one step further is actually that you focus on every voice. How do you make it as beautiful as possible? And that's of course typical for counterpoint. It really means that you know a lot about voicing and how to get from one chord to the next in the most beautiful way, actually in a way so that every voice, so soprano, tenor, alto, bass, that they all have a beautiful melody. To get there we really have to do a lot of practicing, and I will give you some exercises. And let's start with, well, it sounds simple, a variation with only two voices. But you will notice that actually the less voices you have, well, it's not really that it gets more difficult all the time. But of course, when you only have two voices, you can imagine that every voice is really important. You don't have that much to choose anymore. You really have to make sure that every next note has a meaning. When you play chords, you can always rely on having the right triad, and then it will sound okay. But if you have only two voices, or maybe three later, you really have to make sure that every voice counts. So let's use our famous old hundredth again and do a two-part improvisation. And let's start with a harmonization with the melody in the top voice and accompanying it with the lower voice. And what you basically do then is that you use a lot of bass notes. So it needs to have something like this. And of course you can't only use bass notes like 1, 4 and 5, you have to use inversions, otherwise you double a lot of the melody notes or it just sounds boring. The next step is making it interesting by adding little motifs and broken triads probably, and sometimes you can actually scale up or down and then it fits. And important here is that you really realize how can I make it as interesting as possible against the melody. And one of the things that can help you as well is having a parallel third or sixth, because that always sounds wonderful. So you could end up with something like this. Now we try it the other way around. So now my left hand is playing the melody and the right hand is doing interesting things on top of that. Here the main rule is make sure that you have a lot of parallel thirds, so like this. That is kind of your basic way of thinking, and on top of that you make again motifs, broken triads, things like that. So you end up with something like this. you noticed I made every note of the melody the same length, and that's typically for the Baroque. We have seen it before. You just make it as simple as possible. So no complex rhythms in the melody so that you can focus on the counterpoint. And now, of course, the last step, now we can alternate. Let's start with the melody in the right hand, the second line in the left hand, and so on. Important here is that you try to make the mix work as beautiful as possible. So when one line gets the melody, it's important that you really know where does it come from. So let's say we have done the first line, and now the second line, the melody is in the left hand. It can't be that the B, which is the first note of the second line, comes out of nowhere. The left hand already had to make sure that it was in the right direction. And this is, of course, what we talked about before, the thinking ahead, the little chess game, that you really make sure that you think already on the first line, during the first line you think already about the next line, what to do, how to get there. And that's very important, otherwise it sounds kind of silly when there is no connection between the lines. So let me show you what I mean. I start with the melody in the right hand, second line in the left hand. And like always, make sure you do it step by step. First only right hand melody, only left hand melody, and then you start combining things. And you'll see if you change the rhythm, if you also take another hymn tune in a different key, in a different meter, then you will suddenly have new ideas. So for example, you can also do it in triplets, and let's take our famous Psalm 93 for that, and then you can end up with something like this.